All right, how's it going? Thank you guys so much for coming out this morning. I know it's a little early, but it's good to see you all here bright and early. And what we're going to be talking about today is web components. You guys can come on up, sure, why not? Grab a seat, grab a seat. Yeah, sit right next to me, sit right here. Now, for those of you who didn't catch Dimitri's panel the other day, I just want to give you kind of a quick high-level summary of what web components are and kind of what we're going to be talking about this morning. So web components give developers the ability to extend the HTML vocabulary. And with that, we get this much easier model for creating reusable, encapsulated little components we can compose together. Now, today there are a handful of libraries which are being built on top of the web component standards. You've got Xtag, Bosonic, and Polymer by these guys up here. And the cool thing is that now that we have this whole ecosystem of tools that's available to us, we have this sort of growing world of components that are being built. So you've got the core and the paper element sets that have been produced by the Polymer team. You've got the brick set that's being built by the folks at Mozilla. And you also have just a whole slew of components that are being built by individuals out there, put up on GitHub and shared on sites like Component Kitchen and CustomElements.io. So with this big change comes a lot of questions. Developers are wondering, what are some of the best practices around working with web components? And they also want to know, when are these things going to be production ready, right? When can we actually start dropping these into our apps? So to help answer some of those questions today, we've got a really great panel. Just to introduce really quickly, down here at the end, we've got Matt McNulty, who is the engineering team manager for Polymer. Next to him, we have Taylor Savage, who is the product manager for Polymer. To my right, your left, is going to be Kevin Schaaf, engineer on Polymer. To my left, your right, is Dimitri Glazkov, godfather of web components and software engineer on Blink.
Uncle of web components.
Uncle of web components. Next to him, we have Steve Orvell, engineer on Polymer. And at the end there, we have Alice Boxhall, an engineer on the Chrome team who is specializing in accessibility. So we've got a lot of good questions. But if you out there in the audience have a question, we have a microphone up here. And for those of you watching on the live stream, you can tweet at ChromiumDev, and we'll try to get those questions asked to the panel as well. Well, let's start with the first question here from Hector Carmona, who wants to know, are there any steps that must be taken to ensure that an application is accessible to screen readers when working with Polymer? That sounds like a good question for you, Alice.
Yeah. OK, so there's sort of a couple of facets to that. So yeah, as mentioned, I think Matt mentioned yesterday when we talked about Polymer, we were talking about a few different things. So I'll address the Polymer, the paper elements part of the question first. So if you're using paper elements, by 1.0, you shouldn't have to do anything extra. So today, the accessibility story is a bit of a work in progress. So you'll look at some elements, you'll see that they're extremely accessible, all the markup's been done. Other elements, there's still some work left to be done. But by 1.0, they should be, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, completely accessible.
Yes. Yay!
So yeah, so I know that the team has been working incredibly hard on that and learning a lot about accessibility. So if you're not using the core or paper elements, you're creating your own elements, yes, there's definitely extra work that you have to do, and this is the work that the Polymer team have been doing. So essentially what you have to do is what you would do today, sort of what you do in the pre-web components world to actually create accessible sort of custom widgets just built using divs and spans and so on. And that is to use technologies like ARIA to specify the semantics of the element. So with native elements, these semantics are specified by the browser and actually baked in. When you're creating custom elements, you have to specify your own semantics. So there's plenty of resources on the web on how to do this. There's articles. There's a Google DevBytes talk that I gave for I/O this year, which sort of outlines at a high level what you need to do. But yeah, the answer is that you definitely will need to do extra work if you're creating your own elements, and that would be a great thing to do.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, so our next question comes from CrossProduct. I'm assuming that's not your real name. If I'm adding third-party components to my application, how can I know that they'll perform well and not bloat the file size of my app? That seems like a good one for either Kevin or Steve. You guys have an opinion?
Yeah, I can take a shot. So the awesome thing about encapsulation is it hides complexity, right? So the tricky thing about encapsulation is that it also hides complexity, right? So you pull in this custom element that you found in a catalog, and the awesome thing is you don't really have to know what the guy, what kind of feats of engineering the guy had to do inside of it to make this awesome spreadsheet component or something. But at the same time, you're a little bit removed from what's in there. So I think there's two good answers to this question. So one is, as Matt mentioned yesterday, we're doing a ton of work right now on performance of Polymer. So when you're, we think composition is such an awesome tool that you shouldn't have to be, limited by having to think, do I need to only put 3 things in here because I need to worry about performance? So a lot of the work we're doing is so that you can, much more freely, compose things to get the right abstractions and the right level of componentization. So performance, I think, is a big answer to this. Just so that you're not being taxed for every custom element that you're putting in there, to the extent that you might be today with the current version of Polymer. I think another answer to this question is really where the community comes in. And Rob just mentioned, so we have kind of community-based catalogs that are springing up. So we have Component Kitchen and CustomElements.io. Yeah, and we have Jan here in the audience who's working on one of them.
And Zeno, yeah.
Oh, and Zeno, yeah, great.
They're even sitting next to each other.
And so having these catalogs, and especially once we have things like reputation systems in those catalogs, so that you have 4 spreadsheet components, the one that's got 16 stars next to it, and has the payload size mentioned, and everyone raving about it. These are the things that we can have spring up in the community to help people navigate their way through these third-party elements and figuring out which ones are the good ones and not.
Yeah, totally. I think that we definitely are going to look towards the community to stand up the sorts of catalogs to help us figure out, what's the best stuff to use, what should bubble to the top, and really that's just going to come from folks using it, trying it out, starring things, and liking them, whatnot, and actually using them in their projects. All right, so the next question is going to come from who is this? Dave on the internet. What's up, Dave? Dave, what's up, dude? What solutions do you recommend to manage dependencies and the build process in a complex application with web components? In particular, I think Dave is interested in things like package managers, and he's asking, are Bower or NPM up to the job?
Sorry. Okay, so first thing I want to say is, at Polymer, we're building a library fundamentally concerned with making UIs, using custom elements to do so, using these new web component technologies. The tools that you're using for these things are still on the table. We're not taking those away from you. And the goal here is to sort of build in a standard way such that, we plug into your existing workflow as well as we can. Having said that, we've chosen to use Bower as a mechanism to get our components to our users. We think it's relatively good. It serves our basic needs, but we're certainly not wedded to it, and we're open to change here. And we definitely recognize that the NPM community is growing and wants to sort of provide better front-end sort of client-side support for pulling in resources. And we want to be nimble here and use the tools that support well the tools that the community wants, and so we certainly will sort of embrace the tools as they mature to become useful. And again, for us right now, we found that Bower sort of filled the hole that we needed in the best way. Having said that, as far as managing dependencies, HTML imports is a great way to do this. So fundamentally, the unit of what a thing is in HTML imports is HTML, which makes a lot of sense because this is the fundamental thing that we are actually building here is web pages that use HTML. You can pull in actual HTML declarative tags. You can pull in CSS. You can pull in scripts. You can support composition. You can nest imports inside each other. It's great. And fundamentally, we might ask, okay, but HTML import sounds good there, but if I nest my resources like that, that sounds like a lot of network requests, and we all know that that's a potential issue. So on the Polymer team, we built a tool called Vulcanize, and the tool basically says, okay, that's great, you're using HTML imports, and when you go to production with this, you probably want to reduce the number of network requests you have, and you can Vulcanize your imports, and basically what it does is it just says, okay, I'm going to concatenate, just like you would with script. I'm going to concatenate those imports into one file so I can make one request. And again, this fundamentally solves that problem. We also realized that there's a lot of sort of existing solutions, and as I said, we want to support those. And there are a number of module systems that are really focused around dealing with JavaScript primarily. There's ESX modules, which is a standard that's coming, and there's AMD modules, and there's Require.js. There's a lot of tools like that. And I would like to say that fundamentally we don't see really any like core issues with these things working together with HTML imports. And I would like to say that QuickOffice, which I know Matt spoke about yesterday, that's a big project within Google that uses Polymer technologies, actually does use Require.js and HTML imports together. So again, we just sort of worked with them to make sure there's no rough edges there, and we feel like fundamentally this can work together well.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that too is that I know that in Vulcanize, we're working to improve that tool a bit so that it's easier to exclude things from different bundles. So you could actually break your dependencies up into like your critical elements and maybe your less critical elements, and then lazy load those, at a later point. Yeah, thanks, Jan. Like right now, excluding stuff in Vulcanize, you can do it. It's a little bit of work because you have to kind of know everything that's in the other bundle, and you've got to write it all out kind of line by line and say exclude all these things individually. We're working on some changes that might make that a lot easier, where you could just say, okay, in bundle B, just exclude everything from bundle A, and that could make it a lot easier for you to then start lazy loading things. So another thing to consider, lazy loading is probably going to be a bigger pattern that we talk about in the future as we figure out how we want that to work in these apps. All right, next question is, why can't I keyboard tab through the Polymer elements today? And I'm assuming they mean the core and the paper elements. And will this be fixed by 1.0? So that sounds like a good question for Alice.
All right, so yeah, I when I saw this question, I kind of laughed to myself, and I was a little bit confused because as I was saying, the Polymer team have been doing a lot of work on accessibility, and keyboard handling is actually a big part of accessibility. As you can imagine, if you're using a screen reader, you're really accessing things a lot via the keyboard if you're on a desktop device. So I went and took a look, and it turns out that most stuff is keyboard accessible, and you can tab to it, and there's just no focus styles. So I think we need to punt this one right along to the material design panel later on, and you can ask them why there's no focus styles.
Sick burn.
So you're saying they are navigable, there's just no visual indication that focuses on it?
So there was briefly a visual style on this that you can also ask the material design panel that involved pulsing. And we actually, unfortunately, left that in there when we announced all the material design stuff at I/O, and really quickly removed it because it was incredibly irritating. So now we just haven't replaced it. So, but we got to work on that. There's an entire document on it.
There's way too much cross-panel pollination going on here.
One other thing I wanted to add was, just give me an opportunity to mention some work that's ongoing here, is there's, Shadow DOM kind of changes a lot of fundamental behavior about the browser, and custom elements introduces a lot of new stuff. And so one of the things that we as a team like to do is if we see something that the platform, native elements in the platform can do that we can't do, we ask guys like Dimitri to say, hey, can you give us that power? Can you fix that? And one of the things that, and he says, that's really hard, and nobody at other companies is going to agree, and it's going to be tough to do the standards process. But that's why he's the godfather. But so one of the areas, for example, that came up specifically with respect to focus is lots of times you want to make a custom element, and this might get slightly complicated, but where, hey, I want to be focused, but I want to maybe delegate focus to some control that's inside me. And a perfect example of a platform element that does this is an input, which is type date. In this case, you call focus on the input, and inside that there's like individual editors for like the month, the day, and the year. And it works really well, and it integrates with tab index perfectly, and it does exactly what you think. And if you try to do this with a custom element today, it's very tricky, and you have to end up writing a lot of code, and it's difficult. So actually, Alice and I have been working with a couple of great Blink engineers in Tokyo, and there's ongoing work to make this, to fix this. And this is one of these areas where sort of Blink is doing implementation work. We're going to sort of make sure it makes sense, and it'll sort of the feedback will go back into the spec, and we'll make sure that other browsers implement this the same way. But the bottom line is you'll be able to create custom elements that have this kind of complex focus behavior that the elements in the platform do. So it should be awesome.
Good. Now, one of the things that you mentioned just then was that sometimes we want to add stuff, and you go to Dimitri and you're like, "Hey, can we add this?" And he says, "Well, I don't know if the other browser makers are going to agree on that." And that's actually just kind of a larger question that developers have. So a lot of folks are saying, web components seem really cool. I want to use them, but I got to make sure that if I'm using something, it's supported in all browsers. And so do you guys see there being a problem with web components picking up adoption in some of the other browsers? Are we ever going to reach some sort of consensus on this? I feel like that's a good question for you, Dimitri.
This is a good question. All right. It's also a hard question. Going first is hard in any case. And gosh, I wish we didn't have to do this first and somebody else would do web components first and figure it all out. But it's us. And yes, a lot of things that we've done is not scientific. It's intuition-based because you can't get data-driven about a feature until you actually start having usage of the feature. And so there's a certain chicken and egg problem. You can't ship anything until you get some usage out of it. You can't get usage out of it until you ship it. And the thing that's going to happen is, yes, we will probably realize that there are some mistakes we've made. And we need to listen to you and look at the patterns that you're forming around problems, identify those patterns as either, oh, this is a useless feature, we can just remove it, or, oh, this problem has not been solved yet, so we need to solve it. And similarly, as far as the browser developer is concerned, there is definitely going to be interesting, we already are having really good discussions with Mozilla who are implementing web components. And the way we wrote the spec, for example, was very like, well, this is how it should work. And turns out when you have a different browser implementation, this is how it should work is just a vague phrase that doesn't make any sense in the implementation context of a different browser. So we have to go and tune the spec and kind of go, oh, this is actually needs to be a more precise wording, and this is a much more difficult problem or question to answer. And so going through this as well is just going to be an iterative process. And I don't see this, like I mentioned earlier, and yesterday actually at my presentation, this is just the beginning. Web components are going to grow and mature, and as part of that, there will be changes, and we expect those changes. And we talk to pretty much every browser vendor. All of them want you to be happy. And the gist of the uncertainty is whether the web components are solving the right problems, and the best way to find out is to have you use it and react to it and provide data. And once we have data, we can act on it. And that's what we're going to do.
And that was one of the unique things about the Polymer project is being embedded in the Chrome team. We've done a lot of that iteration throughout, right? And basically none of the specs exist today in the form they were in when we joined as a result of that iteration. And even still, there's going to be things that we've missed, or as Polymer matures and as Web Components matures, and as other vendors come along, that we'll realize we have to change, and we'll do that.
And this was a really formative. May not be clearly visible, but the process of Polymer teams starting to first chew on specs the way they were was amazing to me because, first of all, they messed up all of my perfect world. Turns out that when you design things by yourself, you imagine things perfectly, and everything works exactly right. But then when pesky users come and start trying to use your stuff, everything falls apart. And that was amazing. It was like just the process of watching it and adding functionality and removing it and reshaping it was a really good process. And I fully expect that this continues to happen as more users start using it. I think we got the basics right, but there's going to be interesting things like focus and figuring out how do you do that multiple input thing? What is the right way to do this? And we're going to see more of that.
Add one thing really quickly, which is I think that what I spoke to previously about focus, this is primarily additive. So this is not going to, if you start relying on these things, this isn't going to change fundamentally how you use it. And then the one other thing that I just wanted I just recalled and I want to mention quickly is that we have been collaborating with Mozilla. One very drilled-in issue was, how should events flow through Shadow DOM? And this was, a particular topic in which Mozilla had I think they actually just their model for thinking about it was a little bit different than the way that it was implemented in Chrome. And I don't think that the Blink implementation for this has changed yet, but I think this was an area of very lively discussion. And this is one of these things that's super drilled in, and I think for the normal developer, you would not, you'd probably write 1,000 applications and never really care about this. but I think it's an area where I actually think that it's very possible that the Blink implementation will change to based on the input that Mozilla gave, and this was one of these things that you got to hammer out. So I think a lot of these technologies changes are going to be additive, and where they are not additive, I think we're really looking at trying to make them as low impact as possible. And this is a case where I think nobody would really notice the change, but it might make it easier to get agreement and get more people adopting it. So.
Cool. And then kind of piggybacking off of that a little bit, we have this question from Matthias Beinens. He's saying, now that you do have some browsers which are picking up web components, what do we think about, is there going to come a time where we don't need a library like Polymer, where we don't want to use a library like Polymer? What does that look like to you guys?
Well, so I think part of that question probably comes from a misunderstanding that I talked to you about yesterday around the polyfills being part of Polymer. So we would love a world in which we don't have polyfills at all, right? Because it means the web components are out there and widely accepted. I don't think that's going to happen for a while, because I think the web platform is going to start moving faster now, and we're going to have new technologies and things like service worker and promises and all these things coming that will require polyfills kind of going on to the future. So the polyfills as a tool are never going to go away. But the web components ones certainly will, hopefully really soon. So that was kind of part one. I lost my train of thought.
Sorry, so the polyfills are going away, but then, what do you see for Polymer in the future?
So, above that Polymer itself, there's always going to be, Polymer is opinionated, right? And it's going to provide syntactic sugar. So you want those primitives to be primitive. You want them to be so expressive that no one up here can think of all of the different uses for them. That, like what Dimitri was talking to, the intersection of your perfect little world with actual users, those users are going to come up with things that are much more awesome if you've got a really low-level primitive that's really expressive. So to a certain extent, there's always going to be room to sugar those primitives, and there's always going to be room to have an opinion and a variety of opinions, right? So there will be more libraries like Polymer that use web components going forward. And they'll have a place for a really long time.
You mentioned the polyfills there, and another question that a lot of developers have is, what are we doing to ensure that those polyfills and Polymer in general run well across all these different browsers? Because we are trying to support a lot of things on a lot of different platforms.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So fundamentally, when we look at web components, we're talking about custom elements, HTML imports, Shadow DOM, things like the template tag. Template is a good example of there's actually pretty good support for this now, and it's really only IE that doesn't have it. And it's not the hardest thing to polyfill. Custom elements, as it turns out, it's incredibly convenient for the browser to do all that work. But you can write a polyfill, and it's not that bad if your browser is modern. If you go back to IE10, it's very painful, but we actually do support that. You go back further, it's we said it's a little too hard, but I think it's theoretically possible to extend support a slightly farther back if there's demand. HTML imports, again, it's incredibly convenient for the browser to do all that work, and there's certain things that around fetching that a polyfill really cannot do. But fundamentally, this is also something that's not really impossible to polyfill. And so we've definitely taken a lot of time in effort to sort of make sure that the custom elements polyfill and the HTML imports polyfill work really well and are fundamentally pretty sound, and we don't feel like there's huge caveats for using them. Shadow DOM, on the other hand, is a very very, very difficult thing to polyfill. Fundamentally changes the way the browser works, right?
We weren't entirely sure you could polyfill.
Yeah, and really this is one of these things where, we had a couple of engineers that were almost too good. They did like almost too good a job and sort of proved that it was fundamentally possible. But what we found in practice is there's a pretty significant both performance penalty to trying to polyfill Shadow DOM correctly, as well as
the point of polyfills has never been performance.
Yeah.
It's been compatibility.
So this is
if you could polyfill something performantly, you don't need the native feature.
Yeah. So this is one of these things that's actually really tough for us because on the one hand, we really want to use this awesome technology to sort of push this forward. On the other hand, it's like, whoa, it's really painful to use it on a browser that doesn't support it. And not only is there a performance problem, but there's a really long tail of bugs because it's fairly intrusive to how again, fundamentally changing the way the browser works. So we've done a good job squashing those bugs. And then there's another thing, which is it does CSS encapsulation, which we love and we hate, depending on your perspective. But fundamentally, this is like something that is exceptionally hard to polyfill in a way that is not like, oh, my page now takes 10 minutes to load. So what we chose to do for CSS from the start was to say, okay, we're not going to try to be super correct here. We're going to sort of try to be practical. And moving forward with our new version, we're sort of stepping back and taking a look at Shadow DOM and trying to sort of apply that same rule a little more broadly and say, we're going to be a little bit less correct. We're not going to make as much, we're going to still have the polyfill, but we think that practically speaking, we can get a lot of the benefit here, having more of a shim instead of a polyfill. And what this would do is it would allow us to, again, this is sort of part of a vision in our new version 0.8 to say, oh, you can use this in browsers that don't support it, and the penalty for using Polymer in browsers that don't support these technologies is not as great. And yes, there are going to be some trade-offs there. Like, you're not going to get the same guarantees that you do in Chrome. However, with some cooperation, we can get, again, most of the benefit and sort of prove out that web components make sense and get kind of the feedback that Dimitri was talking about. And people go, if thousands of web pages start using these things, and Mobile Safari mostly works, but there's a couple of issues with the performance is good enough, but there's some issues with, it's not native. This is pressure for this to be, we hope, more adopted more widely.
Yeah, and one other thing that I wanted to add there was, we talked a lot about how we're polyfilling all these things in different browsers, but how are we actually testing those polyfills? What are we doing, and how should developers test these things? Because, it's, as you mentioned, the behavior is not exactly the same under polyfill versus Chrome, and so are there things that people can do to unit test their elements or integration test their elements? So, like, how would developers do that today?
Yeah, so maybe 3 or 4 months ago, we kind of started to tackle this problem head on. So the interesting thing about custom elements, and it's a little unique from kind of other frameworks, is that you're actually creating an actual element in the DOM. So you have this tight coupling with the DOM. So there's really no way to test a custom element outside of the DOM, first of all. So that was kind of a unique problem with just being able to build a testing framework that tests these things. It requires the DOM. So that's one. And then, as you say, because we have this variable of the polyfills across, which introduce slight differences in behavior across platforms, it was really important that we were able to easily, kind of on a per check-in basis, be able to test, run our tests across all these different browsers. So we've been spending a lot of time, like I said, the last 4 months or so, developing what we're calling web component testers. So it's kind of a framework, and right now we're integrating with Sauce Labs to be able to easily kind of with Sauce Labs and GitHub, so that when you push a change to a component, it can run continuous integration across a suite of browsers in the cloud and return you those results. So I think and the intention is that this same framework can be rolled out and used on anyone's third-party components going forward. So look for more details on that. I think we blogged maybe a little bit about it.
Yeah, the 051 release has got some stuff about that in the blog.
Yeah, blog.polymer-project.org has a whole section on Web Component Tester, if you want to check that out. And I believe also we have the seed element project, which is it's up on GitHub at polymerlabs/seed element. I believe, Ian, if that is using Web Component Tester? Yes, okay. So if you go and check out the seed element as well, that's basically an example. You could just follow that, implement it with your own element to get some of those tests up and running. Switching gears a little bit, let's talk about some of the other libraries that are out there, or some of the other things which were even shown today, or sorry, yesterday here. So yesterday, my British doppelganger, Matt Gaunt, got up here and showed Google's Web Starter Kit. And a lot of people are interested to know, when is it appropriate to use Google Web Starter Kit? When is it appropriate to use Polymer? And really, like, what are the differences between the two?
Yeah,
Taylor?
I can answer this. Yeah. So first, starting off, kind of reiterating the difference, and they're two totally different tools. So Polymer, at its core, is for building components. And you can build little UI components, or you can build arbitrarily complex components. And with composition, you can nest these components together to build entire apps. And Web Starter Kit's exactly what it sounds like. It's a starter kit. So it's a great jumping off point. It's a great skinning of existing kind of classic web apps that are span and div. And kind of most importantly, it's for older browsers. So Polymer's always been and will continue to be future-facing. We support evergreen browsers with the polyfills. We're able to reach back a little bit more and support slightly older browsers. With Web Starter Kit, you get kind of all the way back. So if you want to get that nice material design look, kind of a light shim over your existing kind of classic web app, Web Starter Kit's a good way to go. If you want to build these complex, kind of future-facing, really nice, silky smooth web apps with all kinds of behavior, Polymer's probably your way to go. And then on top of this also, the paper elements is just kind of one set of components, happen to be built by the Polymer team using Polymer, that shows what you can do by skinning a whole set of elements and making them work specifically together. And so that's our material design implementation. But again, it composites and groups the design into different phases. So we have things as simple as buttons, or we have entire scaffolding layouts. So if you want to read, actually, Web Starter Kit, you can look through and get a nice top-to-bottom, app-wide, what should the best practices for design be. And with Polymer, we actually implement these as components, so you can kind of drag and drop them into your app as you'd like. So that's kind of the difference between Web Starter Kit and Polymer.
Yeah, just to add to that really quick, like when I threw together the website for the Polytechnics, which is itsacademic.com, I really just wanted like a traditional content site. I wasn't trying to build an application. I was just trying to make a site so people could go and figure out where the Polytechnics were. And for that, I didn't actually use Web Starter Kit. I was just using like regular HTML and Sass, just kind of like rolled my own thing. But I would have used Web Starter Kit. It would have been totally reasonable to use it in that situation. There was one thing, though. I had this really complex map thing that I wanted to build. And so for that, I used Polymer. I built a widget out of Polymer, and I used it specifically in that application. So the two are not mutually exclusive either. You could use App Starter Kit, or sorry, Web Starter Kit and Polymer together if you want. You want maybe some interesting widgets that you want to drop into that app. So you could use both. Now, kind of piggybacking off of that, you've also got libraries out there like AngularJS and Ember. One person is wondering, with AngularJS 2.x embracing web components as well, can you guys talk about how the two align and which one should I choose? And this question was asked by Carlos Santana, so that's exciting. I guess he's into guitar playing as well as web components. So
yeah, he's a big Angular enthusiast.
Yeah,
so.
He's a real Renaissance man, it seems. So who would like to take that one? Matt?
Sure, I'll take it. Yeah, so Angular is a really popular library. It's great. People use it a lot. We talk with them quite a bit. It's awesome that they're going to be supporting web components with Angular 2. We're going to have to wait and see a little bit to see, exactly what form that support's going to take. So, we'll kind of have to wait and see a little bit. But it'll be great. But regardless of that, one of the great things about web components is that it's just HTML, right? So unless your library takes, an optimization path or ignores the fact that custom elements could ever exist, you should be able to just drop these things into any existing app in any existing framework. So I think as web components becomes more popular, it's going to be a lot easier to do this kind of interop. And then changes we're making in Polymer 0.8, using events for change notification and things like that should also help a lot of the interop. So I think it's going to end up, Angular is really popular. I think we're going to end up, the pattern of using Polymer elements in Angular and Polymer together is probably going to be a pretty popular solution as well.
The only thing I want to add to this is the future that we see is a future in which you don't have to choose A or B. You can choose A and B. And, again, custom elements provide a mechanism that we can sort of make these things lightweight enough that they can be used together easily.
All right, so the next question, so folks are wondering, is it the plan of hybrid Polymer web apps to be an alternative to Android apps written in Java? If so, when will they be equally usable in terms of performance? This is something that actually I've had a few people ask me just here at the event. They come up and they're like, well, I see all these really cool components, and I'm not quite sure. Should I be building a hybrid app? Should I be building a native app? And how do I decide between the two? So, Matt?
I'll take that one again. So one of the awesome things about the web is its ubiquity and reach, right? So it's across basically every platform that exists has a way of doing web content. Many native apps use web content as well, or hybrid apps today. So that's great. It's already there. And we think Polymer is going to be a great way to build apps across absolutely any one of these platforms, including things that aren't internet connected, right? HTML is an awesome way to build UIs, regardless of whether it's connected to the internet. So that said, performance characteristics are different on every single platform, both on the web across different platforms and native versus web, right? I think there are, if you look at our Topeka app from I/O, it's got native quality performance on Android. Particular things in Android's framework are slow or janky, right? Just like they're on the web, it's just different. It's a different flavor of janky. So I think that said, Chrome's performance is improving dramatically, especially in the last year or so. So we're finding it a lot easier to build really high-performance web apps on Android lately. And then, iOS has always had really smooth animations and things like that. So it's going to be an evolving story. And the great thing is if you use the web, you can kind of reach it all.
And then, sort of piggybacking off of that really quickly, someone was asking, would we recommend going ahead and using Polymer in a client application today? And if not, why not? And when is there a good time for them to start doing that? And how are they going to know when that good time is?
Are the Salesforce guys still here? So I think we sort of answered that yesterday, right? I think that it is, depending on your level of tolerance for being an early adopter, you can absolutely use these things today. And Salesforce and News Corp and things like that are examples of that, as well as YouTube and other Google properties that they're dipping their toes in the water as we speak. So I think it's ready today, and please use it and tell us if it's not, and tell us exactly how, and we'll fix it.
The only thing I would add to that is just that any of us who have built complicated applications on any platform, you all know that it's really easy to make a thing that is very bad, right? And I mean, the way I like to think about this is, when you're sort of using the basic core building blocks that the platform that you're using gives you, what kind of headroom do you have? When do you have to make these tough decisions about performance, and when do you have to optimize and sort of say, okay, this is a complicated thing, I better figure out how to do this in a way that my application doesn't really slow down. And when is the platform really supporting your use case in a way that's sort of helping you from having to worry about this? And this is one of the areas that we really felt like Polymer needed to do a little bit better, as Matt said. So we want to try to increase that headroom such that you can really feel confident about using these elements. They feel lightweight, and they, it doesn't feel like, I don't want to include that thing because that's going to slow my app down, right? So this is, one of our goals going forward is just, you can do really well today. The headroom is there, but our goal is to sort of increase that so that it feels even better in the future.
And can you guys talk a little bit about what the differences are in Polymer 08 specifically? Like, why is it so much smaller than the previous version? And did that simply come from breaking the polyfills out, or is the payload smaller across the board? Like, what's the deal, and why is it so different in terms of performance?
Sure. So I can start that. I'm sure Steve's going to jump in right after me, though. Right now, so I can say the payload difference, the biggest piece of that was moving away from our existing data binding system and making that opt-in, while creating a system that's simpler but still handles a lot of the same use cases. So it wasn't breaking any of the polyfills out. We're still using the custom elements polyfill. We're still using the HTML imports polyfill, and we will still have a Shadow DOM shim. That Shadow DOM shim will probably be somewhat smaller, but it's not kind of a driver of payload. And similarly, we didn't just cut features out to reduce payload as well. Most of the features are all still there in a really similar form.
I would just say maybe 3 points. Fundamentally, Polymer started kind of a little bit as a science project. It was basically, can we use these technologies that this guy made and make something cool? And we were, as Matt said yesterday, I think we were pretty successful in a lot of ways. But one of the things that we did when we did that was we said, let's use these technologies fundamentally first. and see if we can make a good thing. And we know the shape of the thing that we want to make now, and it totally makes sense. And those principles are not changing. But one of the things that we did with this new version is we sort of said, like, okay, let's start from the perspective of we need to make the thing that's absolutely as fast as it can be and add little bit by bit, layer by layer, and not slow down as we do so. This was just a sort of a fundamentally different process, and it allows us to ensure that everything's tight and small and lean. That's the first point. The second point is, as Matt said, sort of our data binding system was really good at dealing with generalized generic data. And that's excellent if you have this problem, and complicated apps often do. But if you're making a button, you probably don't have this problem. So to pay for that system when you just want to use a button, not necessarily a great trade-off. So this is where we said we need a lighter weight thing for a lot of the elements that we're making. And that led to a big complexity reduction and size reduction and speed improvement. And then the last point is just on Shadow DOM, right? The Shadow DOM polyfill is big and tries to be very correct. And again, our goal here is to say we need to be leaner and meaner here, and both in terms of code size and also in terms of actual basic functionality, we're gonna kind of cut it to the core and get just what we need to sort of prove out this technology is going to be fundamentally viable. So that all put together seems pretty good so far.
Lots of flames.
Yeah, and sort of following on that, Charles Grugan from Twitter is wondering, how can we actually start using 0.8, even though it is new and experimental? How can we actually start playing around with it? And will there be a list of possible breaking changes?
Yeah, totally. So right now, did we announce? I don't know that there's. Right now in the Polymer GitHub repo, there's actually a branch. It's called 0.8 preview. I don't really recommend that anyone poke too hard at that because it's very early. But you can get some, if you're really interested, you can get some basic ideas of the directions we're going. Stay tuned. Coming soon is what I can say about that. What was the other part about it?
Yeah, I mean as far as the breaking changes, so as Matt said, we hope to make it around a few minor versions worth of breaking changes. I don't think we've got it buttoned up enough to be able to kind of iterate those or enumerate those yet. But we'll certainly have something like a migration guide when we get to the point where we're going to release it to kind of guide people on how to kind of migrate their code over. And the last thing I'll say is that I think conceptually the way that you're thinking about composing and building applications using Polymer is all of those concepts are 100%. Nothing there has changed. It's really going to be very small, just minor syntactical type changes. I think that'll be involved in going from 0.5 to 0.8.
Yeah, that's really one of the benefits of just working with components is that as someone consuming the component, you only really care about the external interface of that component. You don't really need to or want to know about the internals. And so if those are getting tweaked, it's totally okay. It shouldn't really affect you. And that's sort of the beauty of it, which is something that you really don't have today on the web. If you're using Twitter Bootstrap and they need to change a div in their nav bar, well, you better copy and paste a whole bunch of new markup into your application because you're going to need that new div. Whereas with a component, that can be inside the Shadow DOM, for instance, and you can just say power update, get the new thing, and move along, which is really nice. I just want to remind folks, because some people are asking if they can ask live questions. We do have a microphone right here. I apologize for not pointing that out earlier. If you do have anyone here in the audience who wants to come up and ask something, if you just come stand at the mic, I will call upon you. But let's actually move into a little bit more sort of like technical specifics, because people have questions about how to do particular things with just web components and Polymer as well. One question that we have here is, when is it appropriate to put things in the Shadow DOM versus the light DOM? And curious, Dimitri, if you have an opinion on that.
It's a good question. I think a lot of these assumptions and opinions are going to vary, and how people start using building frameworks around this and building toolkits around this. My thinking always had been that if you want to make things composable, the composition boundaries that you imagine is where Shadow DOM and Light DOM meet. So I would not say when is it appropriate, and that's not the right question. So I guess that was a bad question, sorry. And I said it's a good question. The right question is, when do you need to separate? And answering that question is very specific for your application. So if you need to compose things together and they need to stay separate, then one of them goes in the shadow DOM, one of them goes in the light DOM. If you don't want to do that and don't need any of this ever, then you don't need shadow DOM, right? So
I think one way that you can kind of conceptualize this in your head is to think about kind of like private API and public API. So the things that you put in the shadow DOM of your custom element are really the private internals of your component, the things that need to make it go that the user of it really doesn't have to think about or know about or care about or have access to. And the insertion points that you put, so the content element that you put in your shadow DOM, is really exposing where the public APIs of that are for composition. So that's the place where users can pass light DOM in, and then you can decide, kind of as the author of that public API, how that expresses itself into the DOM of your custom element. So that's, I think a way that users can think about that.
The only other thing I would add is just that I know this question sometimes will be people asking about things like search. Like, well, if I have one element, and how is my page going to be crawlable, right? And this is an important question. I know that, making stuff for the web, this is something that comes up. It's critically important. And the company we're at here has something to do with that. And that's a good question. And I mean, I think what I will sort of say in response is that what we think is great about custom elements in Shadow DOM is their support for composition. When you're making when you're making this system that is really good at that thing, it really is unfortunate to have to worry about, this essentially what is a detail, how the external sort of structure is to this tool. So I mean, one of the things we're trying to do is sort of push the technology forward to try to make the tools smarter at dealing with these types of things. It's almost as if here's my attempt at an analogy, you used Legos and they were great at building things, but you only allowed someone to look at your Lego thing from the top down, and it was kind of lame that way, right? So, you just look at it from a different angle and, it's three-dimensional and it's awesome. So tools evolve is where I go.
All right, so we have a question right here from the audience.
Yeah, so this question is related to that question. When you have injection points going into a shadow DOM, so let's say you have an accordion and the actual content that are going into the panels are injected content, and so they're part of the public API, but as soon as they go into the shadow DOM, they're kind of private API at that point. How would you deal with, like, let's say a user has a tooltip plugin that they're trying to use, and they want to show tooltips on the content of the accordion, but the accordion is now in the shadow DOM?
Yeah, so to be clear, like, so if you have an accordion and it has an insertion point, so the accordion is creating some divs around to open and close, that sort of thing. That's all kind of hidden from the user. But the content that the user passes in through the light DOM, really, that stays in the scope of the user. And so, they should be fully able to compose a tooltip decorator or whatever around the light DOM that they're passing in. So I think these use cases are, should be well supported.
The only thing I would add is today before Shadow DOM, the DOM of the browser is kind of Wild West. If I want to make a thing that, say, makes all buttons blue, I can do that with CSS. If I want to make a thing that makes a tooltip plugin for anything in the whole universe, I can do that with jQuery really easily. And what we introduce with custom elements in Shadow DOM is this fundamental concept of sort of scoping. And the idea is that this helps you with composition. And that's really what it's there for, to help you with composition. So there are times when you go, if somebody says, so as Kevin said, if I'm a custom element guy and I go, I want to use the tooltip plugin in my custom element, that should work great. The support for that is there. If I'm a guy that goes, regardless of what content is on my page that uses custom elements and may use Shadow DOM, I want to use that tooltip plugin and have it apply globally, there we have a tension. We have a tension between composition and sort of encapsulation. And one guy is going to say, I don't want my button inside my scope to be, I want it to be protected from that guy who tries to use this crazy tooltip plugin that I don't want. Another guy is going to go, I want that button inside that scope. I don't know about it, but I want that tooltip plugin to be applied. And this is something where it's like there's really no fundamentally right answer, and we have to evolve the way that we build things such that it sort of makes sense. And I mean, fundamentally, this is something that we're hoping to address better, sort of moving forward. I just say sort of stay tuned for additional sort of opinions and support for this in Polymer.
Yeah, Scott, do you have another one?
So as a library developer, if somebody is using your library and they're trying to interact with content that's injected into the Shadow DOM, should the answer today be, we will not help you because this needs to be figured out in the Shadow DOM and web components?
I wouldn't go that far. What I would say is, again, I see sort of two fundamental use cases. Use case number one, guy is like, I don't want you to deal with my internals. Use case number two, guy from the outside says, I want to tweak this thing. Fundamentally, I think the best pattern moving forward is, a situation where, if guy A made custom element and guy B is trying to use it and has this need, that there's an evolution of the custom element so that it supports that use case. That's a process, right? And in the interim, guy B might go, I'm going to fork your code and change it. Or fundamentally, sort of one of the things that Shadow DOM started as a couple years ago, it started with a much sort of stronger encapsulated boundary. And practically speaking, as users, what we did was we softened it a bit. So for example, initially there was no shadow root property. So there was no way to get at those elements inside. Today there is. So, it is certainly possible for you as a user to say, I need to poke at the innards of that thing. It's not the greatest pattern because it's somewhat brittle, but it's possible. And again, the best solution is for sort of communication and the custom element that you're using to provide the API that it needs.
Steve, really quick, can you explain why was that boundary softened? What was there a reason for doing that?
It's precisely because of this tension, right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? So through Shadow DOM and these technologies, we're bringing, like Steve said, we're bringing this concept of scoping to the web, which really hasn't been there. It's been like this huge global thing, like all the CSS and all of the DOM. It's all in this one big global thing, which is kind of crazy. When you look at like any other computing environment, you would say that's crazy, right? So we're bringing this concept of scoping, and then all of a sudden you start to feel a little bit of this pain of taking away this kind of global toy, like often misused, but sometimes useful global query selectors and global style. And so those things are definitely in tension. And I think it's up to us to help evolve, more tools for helping you, do these kind of cross-cutting type things like theming and the use case that was brought up here.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to get to you guys really quickly, but you mentioned theming, and that is a common question. So someone asked, what are the best practices for managing and coordinating styles between different custom elements so that the design appears coherent? And this is from William in Silicon Valley. And there's a little addendum to this, which is, is anybody else concerned that the /deep combinator is going to end up feeling like important if you're on a really big project? Like too many people using deep, and then that's the new important. So what do you guys say about theming and deep?
Yeah, I can speak to that. This is a big topic, and I just want to say a few things. So I think we're pretty unhappy with Deep and Colin Shadow, which is its cousin, because they feel like too blunt, and also because Blink guys tell us they're really hard to make fast. Polymer is going to try to not rely on those moving forward. And it makes it tough because we have to adopt other strategies. One of those strategies, we have an element called core style that we want to evolve and make more powerful. But the notion basically is there's an indirection between, the styles that an element needs and where it's getting them from.
All right, question from the audience.
Hi, I'm David from the Pinterest web team, and we love web components and we want to use Polymer. Unfortunately, we have to support Android, browser, IE8, IE9, Is there any sort of graceful degradation guides that you have, maybe internally, or that you would, consider writing?
I have an opinion on that. Can I take it? Okay. So one thing to consider if you have to support those older legacy browsers is there's a few different options that you can go about. First of all, you don't have to use all the web component standards. You could just, for instance, just use custom elements. And the polyfill for custom elements, I believe, should work on Android browser in IE9, maybe? The polyfill for custom elements. I know that someone has done a variation of that polyfill that does work on IE9 and Android browser. There's a variation. I think it's just called document register element or something by Andrea.
Oddly enough, the Shadow DOM polyfill works in IE9.
Interesting. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that, custom elements, there are, I don't know if it's our polyfill, but there is a polyfill out there at least that does support custom elements. You could consider just using that just as a starting point. I know that I believe what GitHub does too is they do, maybe I shouldn't say this, but they do user agent sniffing, and they figure out, is this person going to be able to support web components? If so, then maybe I'll give them the web component flavor, and if not, maybe not. But the other thing that they do, which is really good, is they're using a type extension element. So they're for their little time element that is on the GitHub website right now, they've created a custom element that extends the native time element. And so they take a time element, they put a timestamp in it on the server, and they send that down. Now, if the browser does not work with web components, you still get a timestamp. If it does work with web components, well, then that thing kicks in and it starts figuring out the relative time difference and everything. So you get this sort of little progressive enhancement there. So maybe look at custom elements, maybe look at type extension elements, because that way they give you good fallbacks. Those are sort of my two big opinions on that. Anyone else?
Send the older browsers to an older version.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think we only have time for one last question. We'll take one from the audience. Yes.
JB Sungar Consulting Services. So you said that you're removing some things from some of the polyfills. What sort of things you're going to do? What things are performant, and if things are really unperformant, what kind of things are really unperformant, and what are we going to have to do for IE10 and older browsers?
Sure. I think fundamentally around this, I think I would speak to Shadow DOM.
And Steve, if I may?
Yes.
Can I keep it short?
Okay, sorry. So Shadow DOM polyfill as it is today tries to provide a completely correct view of the entire universe. Our goal with the new shim is to say, we don't necessarily need that. Instead, what we need is a completely correct view from the perspective of the element that uses Shadow DOM. By doing that, we can get a pretty massive performance improvement.
Massive simplification that still covers 95% of the use cases that users are going to need.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that the polyfill still exists for the guy who wants the more correct view.
Cool. All right, well, so I want to thank everyone on the panel for coming out today. Hopefully for you guys, this has been an illuminating discussion. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions to us. If you still have more questions, for those of you here in the audience, we're going to be having breakout sessions later in the day, I believe, upstairs. So you can come grab some of us. We'll also be sort of floating around throughout the afternoon. Also, for those of you who had questions on the moderator that were not answered, we're going to try and answer those after the fact. So if you didn't get your answer today, but it was on the moderator, we're going to follow up and try and give you a response for all of those things. So thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon, or this morning.